Welcome to this week's Qdabra webinar. My name is Jennifer Lindsay. I'm an InfoPath developer and project manager with Qdabra. And this week will be the second part of a two-part series on form migration and archiving techniques. The first part of this series was given on August 22nd, so you can go back through the Qdabra website or through our YouTube channel and find the video for that from August 22nd. And in this part two, I'll be briefly glossing over mentioning some of the techniques we demonstrated in that just for continuity's sake, but I won't be actually doing those demos. Instead, I'll be doing a bunch of new demos to continue the series. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So what are we going to be talking about today? Well, we're going to be focusing on techniques that will ensure that your forms will open in the future. Specifically, we'll be talking about techniques for removing dependencies on the form template. So what happens if your template changes or if your template changes location? How can we work on maybe fixing those connections or remove dependencies that are no longer needed? Another big issue that comes up in making sure your forms will continue to open is the dependencies they have on the data connections that may be in the forms. So we'll be looking at removing those dependencies when data connections change location, or rather when the form changes location and the data connections don't, and looking at whether or not data connections continue to be needed if your forms change location. And the last thing we'll be looking at is a very quick and dirty, out-of-the-box technique for archiving your forms. And this, of course, is important because, you know, we want to preserve data and prevent modification of the data going forward. So why is all of this important? Well, I already went over this a little bit on the previous slide, but quite frankly, InfoPath Forms are very tightly coupled with the data sources that they're connected to, and also with the relative locations of the forms and the templates that they correspond to. If any of these locations change, you'll need to look into ways to reconnect your forms, your templates, and your data connections all together so that things continue to operate smoothly for your users. Obviously, data reentry is very tedious. It's a waste of money and time to basically throw your hands up and say, I'm just going to design a new template from scratch and re-enter all the information into blank forms. Copying large amounts of data is very impractical. And archiving your old data is a well-known best practice. It's especially useful if you're saving your form data so that it's available down the line for reference, or if your particular department gets audited in the future. So let's look at template connection dependencies first. And we looked at a bunch of techniques for this in part one of this webinar series. And of course the big question here is, what if your template moves? So you may be migrating your template from one site to another. You may be moving it from a production environment to a test environment to make some changes there, and then moving it back to the production environment. So what happens to your forms in that case? Well, the screenshot that you're seeing right now has a particular link circled in red, and this link is called the processing instruction. This is near the top of every single InfoPath form, not the template, the form itself. And this link tells the form where to go to find the template that it needs in order to open. So if your template changes location, you have the option of manually changing this template connection, which means right-clicking on the XML form itself, opening it up in a text editor such as Notepad. I actually use a slightly more sophisticated text editor called JEdit. That's J-E-D-I-T. It's a free download, and that's what I actually use to take this screenshot you're seeing. And you can see things are nicely color coordinated, which makes it very easy to identify particular bits of information in the raw XML. If you've ever opened up an XML form in Notepad, you've basically seen a sea of black, and it's not very easy for the human eye to read that, which is why I like using this particular text editor. So you can right-click on your XML form, open it up in a text editor, find this link, and then just manually type in, oops, sorry for changing the slide. You can manually adjust this link, and your form will then open as long as the new link you type in here actually points to the right template. This link is called a processing instruction, as you can see here on the screen. There's another technique for doing this change automatically. As you can tell, opening this up and changing all of them by hand would be very tedious. That's called relinking. We'll actually see that towards the end when I demonstrate the archiving technique. Otherwise, that's delved into in detail in part 1 of this series. And Qdabra also offers a tool called the Modify PI for Processing Instruction tool. And this is useful for content types. The relinking technique is an out-of-the-box SharePoint site technique, but it doesn't work for content types, not very well at least. So with the Modify PI tool, you can relink forms that use content types as well. Again, refer back to part 1 of this webinar series to see those techniques in detail. Okay, so that deals with a template that's changing location, but what if your template changes itself? You either go into the template, you make changes to the fields, maybe you change some of the field names, maybe you reorganize it, you create a new hierarchy in the field schema, you add some new repeating groups, you delete some repeating groups. There are all sorts of things you can do to a template, right? So what do you do about the old forms that were filled out using the old version of the template? Well, you can simply throw your hands up and create a new template for all the forms and re-enter all the data by hand. Obviously, Qdabra does not recommend that. There's another technique called side-by-side versioning that was demonstrated in part 1, so I won't be going into it here. But basically, you can have the old data in the old forms that will open with the old version of the template, side by side in the same form library with the new data that will be entered in the future into forms using the new template. And this involves using content types, but the bottom line here is that you can use the same form library for all of your data, the old forms and whatever new forms get filled out after you've made the template changes. Okay, so what about reconnecting your forms to these changed templates, right? Well, the side-by-side technique already has that worked out. The old forms will just look for the old template and open up that way. However, sometimes you may want to simply go with a new template, not have to worry about an old template. I mean, what if you make consecutive changes? Maybe your template's changing every few months. How many times do you want to use side-by-side versioning with a bunch of different content types? That can get to be a lot to manage. Well, in that case, we can use a wonderful technique called the XML transforms, or XSLT for short. And what XML transforms do is they're basically translators. They will tell a form how to interpret the data that was entered using an old form and import that data and display it in a form created from the new template. So it's basically a mapping from the schema used for the old template into the schema used for the new template. Now, some of you may be saying, well, I've gotten away with just sort of redesigning my forms and the data gets ported over quite nicely. If you make any significant changes, if you take a field and take it from one group and put it in another group, the new template isn't going to know, the old form isn't going to know where that field is in the new template. Even if the form will itself open up with the new template, it won't put the data in the right place, and so you may end up with a bunch of blank fields. XSLT fixes that. It tells the old form, okay, here's where to put your data in this new template so that the user will actually see it. There are two ways to use XML transforms. One involves creating a transform yourself, and I'm going to show that to you today. And it also uses the promoted properties, which is an out-of-the-box technique for InfoPath. But we will be using our Qdabra Q rules plugin for InfoPath, which is available as a free trial download from the Qdabra website for those of you who want to try this out later on. Oops, I keep hitting the next button. And we'll be using in particular the transform command on that. Now, this does need to be done individually per form. If you want to migrate, if you have many different templates that you want to migrate, we suggest that you use our DBXL tool. And in particular, we have a migration tool that can assist with moving large batches. If you have thousands of forms, for example, large batches of forms from one template to another. Okay, so let's switch over to InfoPath right now. And actually, I'm going to switch over to one of the libraries that I have open. And I'm going to demonstrate this XSLT technique. And it won't look quite that fancy. Oops. Sorry about that. It won't look quite that fancy when I do it, but I'll show you the magic that's going on behind the scenes. So I'm going to open up a document, a blank InfoPath form in this particular library. It will open up. And this is the original version of the form. I'm going to go ahead and fill it out and then submit a form using this. And then I'm going to switch over to the newer version of the library and show you that by opening up that new form, it's going to find all the data that was entered in this old form and display it in a new form using the new template. Sorry, that's a little slow today. Okay, so here is my original template, and I'm just going to go ahead and use some data here that I entered before when I was testing. So this is just a very simple form, 6 fields. This technique will work on forms that are more complicated, but for the purposes of this demo, it's going to be a very simple form. Salary is not enough. Isn't that true for all of us? Don't tell my boss, though. I'm going to go ahead and submit this form that I filled out using the original older version of the template, and here you can see you can actually see all the data that I entered. And the reason why this data is displaying in the form library is because I use promoted properties. I'll show you that when I open up the template a little later. Now I'm going to go into this new library. This one is called Using Transforms New. And I'm going to simply open up a blank document, and all of the data I entered into the other library is going to be there. And the reason why this data is just going to automatically appear is because I am querying those promoted properties in the other library, pulling them into this form, and using the transform to tell the template what fields to put all of that data into. So the transform is essentially mapping it. Here you see this is a slightly different layout. I have basic information, job information. I've changed some of the field names, but here's the data that I just entered. Great, right? Okay, let's take a look at how this works. So I'm first going to open up the old version of the template. Here is the old template version. And there's actually very little going on in the old template. So what I'm going to first go to is the QRules secondary data source. So our QRules plugin shows up as a secondary data source in the template. And I'm going to go to this particular node called Finished Loading. And this node is where you should put rules that you don't want to run until all of the background code inside the InfoPath application is finished. That way you can make sure that what you're doing isn't possibly going to conflict with anything that InfoPath does behind the scenes to load all of the basic information in the form. So after the form is finished loading, I'm going to simply set username. So all I'm doing here is taking a username field that I have in this form behind the scenes. It's not actually displayed on the form, but it's in the schema nonetheless. And I'm going to take this particular username function. I'm going to set the value of username to be this function, username, which is a built-in InfoPath function that grabs the name of the user that is currently using the form, the current user's name. So I'm going to go ahead and store that. And that will get stored in the main data source in this username field. And then the other thing that I do is go to, I don't know if you just saw what I did, File, Info, and then Form Options. And on the Form Options dialog, I'm going to click on Property Promotion. And here you can see I have added all of the fields that are in this schema over here, including the username. They have all been added as promoted properties. Now, promoted property simply means that these fields will show up as columns in the library once I submit the form. So if I go back to the library that I just showed you, here are those same columns: name, email, phone, company, years, salary, and username. And you can see the data right there underneath. So that's how I get that data into there. And this is an out-of-the-box InfoPath technique. You don't need QRules in order to use promoted properties. So that's all I do in the original version of the template. Now let's look at the madness that goes on in the new version of the template. And here is the new version of the template. Now I'm again going to go to Manage Rules on the Home tab to pop open this Rules section. And I'm going to look at the Qdabra Rules secondary data source. And again, I'm going to look at that Finish Loading node because that's where I put all of my rules for here. Now there are only two rules that go on here. The first one uses the current user's username. So it looks up my username again, or the username of the current user for the new template form. And it's going to set the data source for this using Transforms Original. This is the original library which has been included as a data connection in this new template. And you can see here all of the same fields that we just saw previously. And what I'm going to do is filter the information that gets pulled in here when I query this library. I'm going to filter it by username. So here I have selected the username under query fields. If you're querying on it, if you're filtering the query, you want to make sure you're in query fields and not data fields down here. So I'm going to select that username node under the query fields, and I'm going to set it to be the same username function in InfoPath that pulls the username for the current form user. Okay, that's great. So I've set my query filter. And the second thing I'm going to do down here is simply query the data source. So it's going to query this library, and it's going to pull in any information for any forms that have been submitted using the current user's username. Okay, so now we've queried the data connection, we've pulled in the information that we want. So that means that the secondary data source under data fields now has all of that information that was in the promoted properties is now in the secondary data source. All right, so the second thing I'm going to look at is this transform data command. Now this is where the magic happens, and this is a QRules command that I'm going to actually open in Notepad so that you can see what's going on here. That's probably a little small. Let's see if we can bump the font size up a little bit so that you can see it a little better. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, this transform command is looking at the XSLT file that I created. And I'll show you that XSLT file in a little bit. It's saying use this transform file on the original library, the data that was pulled in from the original library. And this is simply telling it what node to go to in that data connection. And toString false is a default value just to make sure that the information that's returned isn't treated as a string. It's actually treated as XML data. And that's what that's doing. Now obviously all of the complicated stuff is going on in this XSLT file here. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. And I have that open in, oops, I did have that open. Give me 1 second and I will pull that open again. Here we go. This is JEdit, the XML editor that I mentioned earlier. And this is that XSLT. I apologize if this is very small and hard to see. I'm not going to actually go through the structure of the XSLT file. There's actually a great two-part webinar that my coworker and InfoPath MVP Hillary Stupa did last year. And I'll include a link to that in the slides that accompany this webinar. You'll see that near the end. But essentially what's going on here, if you can see, so in the new template I have a field called full name, and what this is doing is saying in this full name node in the new template I want you to insert the value of the name node in the original template. So it's mapping one by one the fields from the original template, which are displayed in pink here, into the nodes in the new template. So this is a one-to-one mapping. For each one of the nodes of the new template, it's telling you what information to get. So for example, the company node here that I have highlighted from the old template should be stored in the employer node in the new template. And that's all this XSLT style sheet does. So once you've written your style sheet, your XSLT file, you would go to Data and Resource Files, and you would add it there. And as you can see, my transform.xslt is here. My transform file is here in Resource Files, and that's how you make it available for the transform command. It knows to look that up in the resource files. And that's how this works. Now, right now I'm only pulling in information from a single form, but you can do this for multiple forms. If you wanted to pull in data from 2 different other forms created from 2 completely different templates, you would put in another query. So you'd have a query on another query rule to query your other data source. You'd have to add the other templates as data connections in here. So you can see I have this using transforms original library is a data connection here. You'd have to add all the other ones as data connections. Then you would put another query and filter that on username or ID or whatever field you want to pull in the data you want. And then you'd have another transform command that would use a different style sheet that you'd created for that other library. And you can do this for as many data connections as you want. Okay, so that is, oops, let me get back to my slides. So that is the XSLT transform technique for pulling in information from old versions of templates into newer versions using promoted properties in the QRules transform command. Okay, let's switch to talking about data connection dependencies. In part 1, we talked about migrating your forms to your templates to another site. If you've ever gone through the publishing dialog, if you want to migrate your template to another site, you simply have to republish it. You can do that by just going to File and Publish, SharePoint Server if you're publishing to a SharePoint site, and then just go through the steps there. Once you reach the last stage of all those dialogues, if you're migrating to another site, you'll see this pop up. And in all this text, it will ask you if the data sources this form uses are also moving, click this checkbox below to make sure that those data sources move to the new site as you move the template to the new site. Well, this is great. I keep clicking on that. What if your data connections aren't needed anymore? So maybe you're moving this template to a new site, and maybe it's part of an archival. You're moving it to your archival site. Well, in that case, if the forms have already been filled out, you're not going to ever need to fill them out again, right? So one way you can get around this is you might not even need to move your data connections. All you would need to do in this case is remove the onload configuration for those data connections. Those of you who aren't aware of this onload option, let me walk you through this particular data connection to show you where that is. So after you've gone through specifying the location of your SharePoint site, you go through the dialog to select the library, you select the fields from the library. On the very last page, right before you click Finish, there's a checkbox that says Automatically Retrieve Data When Form is Open. This means that whenever you open a form, it's going to go look at this data connection and pull in whatever data is available there, if you check this box. So, to make sure this doesn't happen, simply check all of your data connections and make sure this checkbox is unchecked for all of them. That way, if your forms already contain all the data that you need and you're just archiving them for whatever reason, the forms will still just load fine as long as you don't have this onload restriction. So what if you only want some of your data connections to move? Maybe you have a site that has a master data connection and you don't want to replicate it on each one of the sites, or maybe you're moving to a different sub-site on the same site. That dialog that I showed you on the previous slide won't pop up if you're moving to a different sub-site. It only pops up if you're moving to a different site. And then, of course, we all know InfoPath is not infallible. Sometimes the built-in data migration fails for whatever reason. So what do you do in this cases? Well, one solution that again uses our QRules plugin for InfoPath. It uses specific QRules commands and also InfoPath rules on particular nodes to dynamically change the data connection URL when the form loads. This is a really nifty technique. So I'm going to go ahead and show that to you now. And I'm going to show you an example where I have one form on my root site and another form on, so this is the form on my root site here, and then I have the exact same form published to a subsite. As you can see here, there's a /gen in here for my subsite, and this form is going to pull in data from its local task list no matter what. Now if I had just republished the form from the site to the subsite, InfoPath would not have automatically changed those data connections. But because of the technique that we use here with QRules, you'll see that each one of these forms will pull in information from its local task list. So I'm going to go ahead and open the form on the root site right now. And there are two items in here. This is just automatically pulling in data from the task list using a list data connection. And if you look at the, oops, this is the wrong list. Here is the list. So you'll see this is the list on the root site, no gen in the URL. And these are the same two tasks that appear here. Now I'm going to open up this same form, and all I did was publish the form to the new site. I didn't do anything special. All the special stuff is inside the template, but I didn't do anything special when republishing it. You'll see this one says the form is opened from this subsite, and you'll see that it's pulling in all of the list from this particular task. So the data connection to the task list has changed, and it depends on what site it's been published on. Here again is the form that was published to the root site, and it's pulling in the tasks from the root site as well. So let's take a look at the template and see how I got this to happen simply by republishing the form and not having to do anything else except the stuff I did when I was designing the template. So let's look at this dynamically changing data connection URLs. Okay, so how exactly does this work, right? So again, I'm going to go to Manage Rules, and I'm going to go to my QRules secondary data source for the QRules plugin, and I'm going to go to my lovely Finish Loading node where I put virtually everything that needs to happen right after the form loads. And the first thing that we do is finding out what the data connections are for this particular site. So this, this is actually a spare command for submitting. We don't need that for this demo. Here's the command that I want to look at first. So this is a QRules command called change connection URL. And what this does is it queries the list web service for the particular site or subsite that this form is currently published to, that this template is currently published to. And that happens here as you see _VTI_bin /lists.asmx. That's how you access the lists web service for a SharePoint site. This command will basically retrieve a list of all of the lists that are available on the particular site or subsite that the template is currently published to. Okay, so that's great. So we've got a list of all of the lists that are available on this site. And the next thing we're going to do is see if there is a tasks list available on this subsite. Remember, this form is set up to pull in data from whatever the local task list is. So we're going to, let me pop this command open in Notepad so that it's a little bigger. So this QRules command is called getListGUID, and the GUID is a global user ID. That's what it stands for, and every single list on every single SharePoint site has an alphanumeric string that uniquely identifies it behind the scenes to SharePoint and also to InfoPath if you're using a data connection to a list. So this particular command looks at the collection of lists that we pulled in from that previous command. It finds the task list, the list called tasks, and it pulls in the GUID for that particular list. Okay, so by the time we are done with initial data connection setup, we have retrieved that global user ID, that GUID, for the tasks list on whatever the local site is that the template is published to. That's great. This next step here is simply to stop if no GUID is retrieved. So maybe you've forgotten to set up your task lists on this new site, in which case it's just going to stop and there's not going to be any information displayed in the form. If, however, you did remember to set up your task list on the local site, then this rule will not be run, and instead the final rule will be run. And this final rule is called the change connection URL. And let me pop this open again in Notepad so that you can actually read it a little better. My Control-Alt is not working. Occasionally my computer hates me. Okay, so in this particular case, we're calling change connection URL. So this is actually going in to the tasks data connection that was already set up in this form. So if I go into data connections, I already have a tasks data connection in there. That's great. As you can see, this task data connection is pointing to a completely different site from the one that this template is published to. Or maybe you don't recall the name of the site that it's currently published to. Trust me, it's a completely different site. But we don't care because we're dynamically changing this site. And that's exactly what this command does. So it finds that data source that I just showed you. It finds the GUID field in that data source. And then what it is going to do in the next one, what it's going to do, it changes that GUID. I'm sorry, I forgot to place that. What it's doing is it finds the field for that GUID in the existing data source and sets it equal to the GUID that we just looked up in the previous rule. Okay, so we've essentially dynamically changed our data source to look up the tasks list on the local site. Now all we need to do is run the data connection. So we have essentially performed surgery on our tasks data connection to excise the GUID that pointed to whatever task list was this data connection was originally pointing to when it was first set up way back when. We've changed it to point to the task list on whatever site the form is currently published to. And now we can just query it because we've changed the data connection to point to where we want it to. And that's what this does. So that is the dynamically changing URLs. And of course you can do this for more than one list. Maybe if you have 3 or 4 different lists that are all being queried, you can use these 3 steps for each one of those lists. You can simply put more rules on this finish loading node and do each one in succession. Okay, so that shows you how you can move data connections individually without having to rely on InfoPath doing all the heavy lifting for you and not necessarily doing what you want it to. The last thing we're going to talk about here is archiving. So if you watched part 1 of the webinar, or if you've played around with InfoPath Filler, you have probably discovered the built-in PDF conversion. And this is great if you're using a filler form, but a lot of us use browser-based forms, and unfortunately PDF conversion is not supported by InfoPath in browser forms. However, there's sort of a quick and dirty technique that you can use to essentially move your browser forms to an equivalent filler template library, and then open those forms after relinking them to the new filler template, opening them up in filler and using the PDF conversion. So let's take a look at how to do this. Let me find my demo. Here we go. So what I have here is my browser template. So this is a browser-based template. This is the library or the template that your users would use to fill out their browser-based forms. And I'm going to open one of these forms, and I'm just going to go ahead and fill out my information again. And nope, I didn't have a phone number prepared for this one. I'm going to go ahead and fill out this information again. I'm still not making enough. Oh well. And submit that. Okay, so this mimics the typical user environment. You've submitted your form. It's here in the library. That's great. So now you as an admin can come along and you say, oh, I wish I could print this to PDF, but it's a browser-based library. Well, here's one thing we can do. I am going to download this particular form. Once I can reorient myself and find the download button. Jennifer, what's going on with you today? Okay, for some reason my brain is not finding the download button. That's okay. I get to show you the Open with Explorer method. This is great if you have lots and lots of forms to download in a single library. If you click Open with Explorer, of course it opened on my other screen, it will open up that library in Explorer. So now that I've done that, I'm just going to copy this to my downloads folder. Uh-oh, now you're seeing all of the stuff that I have in my downloads. There we go, it's there. And then I'm going to go over to this other library I have set up. Now all I did here was go into the template that I used for the browser form, for the browser library. I simply changed that template to be a filler-based template. So here's my browser template. And all I did was simply go in here, form options, oops, what am I doing? I'm sorry, that was the wrong thing. All I did is go to File, Save As, and notice this has 2010 web browser form template. All I did was save it as a filler form template. And because virtually all of the controls and logic that's supported in browser are also supported in filler, this will not mess up any of the arrangements of the logic or the features that you have in your browser templates. That's all I did was save this as a filler form template and then publish it to a different library. Okay, back to my demo. So here is the filler form template library that I created. I'm going to go to Library and Open with Explorer. And I'm just going to go ahead and take from off screen, I'm going to drag that form that I filled out in the browser library and copy it over to the filler template. There we go. I'm just going to close this. And if I refresh the library in the browser, there we go. So there's the form that I filled out in the browser. It's now been uploaded to the filler template library. Now before I can open this up, I'm going to have to relink this document to the filler template. So to do that, I go to the Library tab. Underneath Current View, I go to Relink Documents. Now notice over here, the template link references the browser template, right? Because this form was created using the browser template. That's fine. What we're going to do is relink this form to the filler template. So after I click relink, you'll notice that this will change, and now look, it says filler template. So now the form that I filled out in the browser and move it over to the filler library and relink to the filler template will open in InfoPath Filler. And that was because I used a slightly different form, slightly different version of the template, but that's okay. It's still opening. And now, you notice this is opened up in InfoPath Filler. This is not a browser. There is a typo here. This should not say browser template. It should say filler template. I apologize for that. But obviously, this is opening up in InfoPath Filler and not in the browser, so it's using a filler-based template. Now I'm just going to go to File, Info, and look, because this is filler, I can publish this to PDF. I can go ahead and save this. I'll go ahead and save it to my downloads. It already exists because I did this earlier today as a test. I'm going to override it. And now if I open this up, you will see a nice PDF version of that template. So again, this is a quick and dirty way to take forms that are being filled out in the browser, moving them over to a filler version of the template that's identical except for the fact that it is set to open up an InfoPath filler, and then relink those forms to the new filler template, and then you have access to the print to PDF. All right. Well, thank you for attending today's webinar. This concludes the information. I have some additional information for you here. If you attended the webinar, you can download these files for free. You can download the slides for today's webinar for free, as well as all of the demo templates. And inside those slides, you'll see a link to the YouTube video for part 1 of this form migration and archiving series. You can also get a link to part 1 and part 2 of the Introduction to XSLT and InfoPath video that my colleague Hillary Stupa produced last year. Even though it's a year old, it's still very relevant. XSLT doesn't really change that often. And I also have a link to a free online XSLT debugger. Now, I actually use Visual Studio to debug my XSLT files. And debugging is important because a lot of times you can get things slightly wrong, and then when you run the transform command, you have no idea why it's really failing. If you open it up in Visual Studio, you have this nifty XML tab that will appear, and you can do XSLT debugging there. However, I know not all of you have access to Visual Studio. If you go to this URL, you can find an online XSLT debugger, which is great. All you need to do is paste in your XML code here, paste in your XSLT, your transform code here, and it'll give you a result and let you know if there are any errors. Okay, well, if you are attending this webinar, you will receive all of the slides and all of the demo forms that you have seen here for free. They will be emailed to you. Thank you for registering for the webinar. And there will be instructions on the forums as well on how to use them and explaining what's going on. If you are watching this on YouTube and you missed this webinar, for just $29, you can go and download all the source files for the webinar from our website. You can also download for an additional $29 additional webinar files as well from anything that we've given in the past. For $199 annually, you can subscribe and get access to all of the webinars that we've published. And here's the URL where you can go to access the webinar kits for our library from our website. Well, thank you very much. If you send us your feedback, you will, as I've said before, you'll get access to all the presentation and the demos that we've given here today. Otherwise, you can get them through our website. Thank you for attending this webinar.